kind of getting used to this outdoor mass, and so I've been talking to Chris Ustra, and we're going to have a halftime at the offertory, and we're still working on the band. We've got the tuba, though, and the glockenspiel, and that's two of the most important ones I remember from college football. So I want to thank you for continuing to come. This is the last Sunday of the liturgical year, and next Sunday, believe it or not, begins Advent and the 4 weeks in preparation for Christmas. We find ourselves in a strange time still. I've said before, I keep thinking of the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 3, where it says there's a time for every affair and every purpose under the heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to embrace and a time to be far from embraces. And we certainly have been far from embraces during this pandemic since March. A friend of mine, as people are realizing that perhaps they cannot gather in exactly the same way this Thanksgiving as they have done in Thanksgivings past, a friend of mine sent me this. It says, "Strategy for Thanksgiving." I'd like to share it with you. It says, "We've been told that only 6 people are allowed to meet for Thanksgiving Day, but 30 people for a funeral. With this, I announce that we will be holding a funeral on Thanksgiving Day for our pet turkey named Butterball that will pass away on Wednesday, November 25th, 2020. Refreshments provided. In lieu of flowers, please bring a side dish." The Ecclesiastes also says a time to weep and a time to laugh. Thank God we still are able to laugh. Today is a very special day in the church. We call it the Feast of Christ the King. And of course, it is the last Sunday before we begin the 4 weeks of Advent, which is the time we prepare for the coming of Jesus at Christmas. So the beginning of the liturgical year in Advent, which starts next Sunday, starts with the anticipation of the promise of the coming of the Lord for the first time. And then the conclusion of the liturgical year is the reminder of the second coming of the Lord when he comes in power and glory and will judge the earth with justice. The encyclical that established this feast is fairly recent in the church. It was addressed to the Catholic bishops in 1925 by Pope Pius XI. But he also wanted the feast to impact the laity. And so in promulgating this feast that we celebrate today, the Holy Father wrote, "If to Christ our Lord is given all power in heaven and on earth, if all men and women purchased by his precious blood are rightly subjected to his dominion, if this power embraces all men and women, it must be clear that not one of our faculties is exempt from his reign. Christ must reign in our minds, which should assent with a firm belief to revealed truths and to the doctrines of Christ. Christ must reign in our wills, which should obey the laws and precepts pertaining to God. Christ must reign in our hearts, which should desire to love God above all things and to cling to him alone. Christ must reign in our bodies and in our church members, who should serve as instruments for the salvation of souls, or to use the words of the Apostle Paul, as instruments of justice unto God. One of the pastors I was looking at, Pastor Steve Mullen and Dr. Dan Worry, commented that the gospel from Matthew on this Feast of Christ the King helps us to remember that we do God's work every day, and that we never quite know all the places we will meet him. There is a story another pastor told of people coming to church on Christ the King Sunday, and sitting on the steps was a person in ragged clothes with a watch cap pulled down low over his face, and a bushy beard, and he had a bag with a bottle in it sitting on the step of the church next to him. And it was a very, very cold day. And what happened is some people noticed him, talked to one another, and then went in the side door, passing him by. Other people went up the steps without giving him a second glance. One parishioner went up to him and said in no uncertain terms that he should be ashamed of himself and that the place to sleep it off was at the Salvation Army, not on the steps of church. Not one person did bring him a cup of coffee, but not one person invited him to come into the church out of the cold. When Mass began to start, they saw this man walk up the center aisle, ascend to the pulpit, take off his fake beard and remove his watch cap, and it was the pastor, a young priest. And he then used that illustration to pertain to this gospel. I was hungry, you gave me to eat. I was thirsty, you gave me to drink. And he explained how God is really depending upon us to be there in the places that God himself cannot be, but where God's love needs to be. And he said he did it not to poke anybody in the eye, but to just kind of give a reminder that this is part of who we profess to be as Christians, as disciples of Christ. Everything we have heard about God's grace is true. God does indeed stand ready to forgive every sin and every act of disobedience. But God also has expectations of how we, the people of God, are to live our lives. In case you're wondering whether you're in the goat pile or the sheep pile, this gospel does remind us of the judgment that Christ will render, which will be just and true. By doing good, we do not attain heaven. That is only through the mercy of Christ and his death on the cross. But the saints that we are called to be were generous. The saints that we are called to be were kind. The saints that we are called to be were filled with compassion. It's what the saints do. Giving and doing does not make us saints. Giving and doing proves that we are saints, the chosen people, a royal nation, a holy congregation set apart for the work of God. Generosity and kindness and compassion, Pastor Steve Molan says, are part of the DNA of a Christian. And once we recognize that God has claimed us as daughters and sons of his Father, the King, and once we realize that we will inherit everything the King has promised, then clinging to things in this world does not seem like the best choice. And in fact, what the world values, the saints diminish in value.